this age of personal agency and kind of taking control of your career and your time, that's something that I feel like is happening more and more, which is pretty cool.
In the pre-call, you were talking about this idea of fractional design leadership. And I think in this time where businesses and companies and brands are all looking at different ways of tapping into talent and work and accessing people and growing and differentiating in an ever-changing landscape, can you talk a little bit about, what even is fractional design leadership? And, then we'll take it from there.
Sure, definitely can break it down. So what is fractional design leadership? The term fractional really can be taken literally. So think of a fraction of cost and time. But the way that I talk about it is that I see it coming with an imbued meaning due to its historical association with C-suite executives in other fields. So to me, it combines a lot of strategic leadership and cultural impact, not just project execution. So the way that this manifests is I tend to come into companies at an executive level for this fraction of time. And then I help those companies through transitions, or I build creative teams or guide brand initiatives. And it's unlike a traditional freelancing or, let's say, like an advisory role, because you tend to be more embedded within the company's structure and you're aligning your contributions with their strategic goals. Should I talk about why I think it works?
Yeah, I'd love to. I've got some questions, but I'd love to hear why you believe it works.
Yeah, if I'm able to land a few fractional engagement models per year, which I've tried to do since I went out on my own 5 years ago, having been a full-time creative leader at different companies for over a decade, it's been really amazing to be able to find similar ways to contribute to a company without necessarily being full-time. So I feel like I get the best parts of leadership. So things like being able to mentor, think strategically, being thought partners to folks in the organization at different levels, being able to influence big bodies of work, but without getting caught in the internal politics or endless meetings. And ideally, it should be a win-win for both the company and the senior executive individual. So for companies, they ideally gain that executive level expertise without the commitment of full-time compensation packages. So, including benefits and equity, although sometimes you can negotiate different ways to get paid, obviously, not just monetarily. But then what happens for the individual that comes in is that we end up gaining diversity in projects and then clients. We have a lot more autonomy to pursue personal interests and the space to continually learn and grow. And the way I see it is that essentially democratizes access to experienced leadership. And if you think of just the future of work and how it's changed specifically over the last 5 years, there are just so many more seasoned practitioners on the market, whether that's due to layoffs or people leaving their jobs. And so this particular model is a great way to flex a lot of leadership muscles and gives people a lot of new opportunities. And again, it's not necessarily a new model in the sense that the word fractional just appeared. It's just a term that was associated with other fields or people at even a higher level. And then now what's happening is it's being reclaimed as a term that can be applied to a seasoned creative practitioner of very senior executive and above level. And it just historically wasn't necessarily a term that was often used in our industry. And now we're just seeing it more and more.
I think it's interesting because, we believe that a brand should be an asset. It should be something that actually generates, equity and revenue and these things for the people who own it. But at the same time, I think we live, with all of these exploding sort of AI tools and freelancers and the ability to create your own stuff, you're seeing these almost two different kinds of companies that are emerging, people that are sort of doing brand in a grassroots way, quick and dirty, and sort of just getting it out of the way so they can move on to the thing that they're actually doing. And then there's another pool of people who are interested in sort of actually delving into brand and investing in these different sort of elements of it and scaling up. And this is, I guess, an interesting way of being able to, like you say, tapping into decades of experience without necessarily having to have that human there all the time. And that there's probably not even enough work for that human to be there and be like delivering value for the entire time, for 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. It doesn't there's not that much there to do.
Yeah, it really, I would say you're bringing up some really great examples because you're also even suggesting different stages of a company's maturity. I see a lot of value in bringing fractional creative leaders in when a company is a little bit more mature. That's not to say that early stage startups or smaller size companies couldn't invest in this type of partner. But what happens is then you're asking a lot from these types of leaders. So titles like principal designer or founding designer have also emerged, at least within the area that I live near Silicon Valley. And they say, like, a lot of founders will say, yes, we value design. Can we find someone who has a lot of experience and can come in? They tend to roll up their sleeves and be more hands-on. And what ends up happening is they may have a big title, but in the day-to-day, they're really just kind of designing and really helping a company get off the ground. It's a little bit different than kind of the specific example that I'm talking about, which is, while I may be hands-on in certain roles, most of the time I'm coming in at these inflection points when either a team doesn't exist or that team requires the next phase in its evolution, but the company is a little bit more mature that they can afford someone with this experience. So really, really, truly prioritizing and valuing that expertise and being able to pay for that. Because what happens is that ideally it truly is a part-time investment where you're working a certain number of hours, but those hours, if they're more limited, then you're probably charging more, and that enables you to have time to do other things, whether that's another fractional role at the same time or, other activities. So, again, it doesn't mean that you can't have part-time help or these types of leaders coming in for project-based work or in early stage companies, but it's almost like there's different tiers of, fractional leadership. And specifically where I've noticed I thrive and where I've just heard a lot of other people in my position like seeking certain types of opportunities, it ends up coming down to, can the company even afford to pay what they're worth because of their value and their expertise, and making sure that it really does feel like a mutually beneficial relationship.
Does it not also come down to, it's not just about can you pay the person, it's like, do you also then have the resource to execute the things that you are doing? So it doesn't help if you come in and tell me that I need this whole design team and these are the roles and this is what they would do, and then I can't actually be able to like acquire that talent and put them to work on kind of big things. So I think it's also a little bit of like a mindset piece. So it's like this is something important. And we believe that investing in design and creative culture and building teams and kind of sort of creating the skill set internally is going to add long-term value to the business. That's the mindset I think people need to have to engage in something like this.
I agree. I will say, just to plus that, all of the successful partnerships I've been able to engage with are really thanks to having those internal ambassadors who really believe in the value of bringing in these fractional roles. And there's something that clicks for them where they either acknowledge that this is something they need as like an interim solution before investing in a full-time person, or they know what I can do. And so they understand that that's something needed in that moment in time. So I 100% agree with you that it's not just can you afford to pay that person what they're worth based on their value and their experience, but actually, being ready to trust someone who can come in and engage in, certain areas of impact. And there could be a lot of different things that person can impact in a short amount of time. And then they can prioritize what those things are together. And sometimes, yes, you're right, like they require certain resources. Maybe it's not always about resources and people, but to your point, maybe it's about a culture shift. But really, it is those inflection points in the company, which can also, mean obviously different things. And then really having the trust and giving that person autonomy to then really come in, diagnose what they think that company needs, and then work with their key partner and determine what those things are based on, whatever the budget is or the time that they have. Because again, if it's part-time, they can't do everything. So really, aligning on what those priorities are. For me, I came up with a framework, maybe we're sharing. Again, this is just my own perspective based on the few instances I've been able to do this, but I've developed this framework called the 4Cs, and the 4Cs are craft, collaboration, culture, and coaching. And those are the 4 areas that I tend to try to have impact when I'm working in these fractional roles. So craft, for the designers listening, it's everything from elevating design quality and creative output across the brands, whether that's the in-house brand that you're working with, or if you're on the advertising or marketing side, maybe working with brands and clients for them, and then respecting each brand's unique DNA. Collaboration is partnering with C-suite execs or whoever may have hired you, aligning with cross-functional teams, maybe. So in often a lot of cases for me, my proposal includes helping source, interview, and then often influence hiring decisions for my full-time replacement, which essentially renders me obsolete. Culture is strengthening creative cultures at these inflection points. And again, that can mean a lot of different things depending on the organization in which you're working in. And then coaching is everything from mentoring creatives or even people outside of the org who are craving even working with someone who has that outside perspective, which is really interesting. I've noticed that when I'm not full-time, people often come to me more, almost like I'm a safe space to talk, because I'm working with them closely, but I'm not full-time. So it almost gives them permission to open up more. We talk about skill development, career guidance. And then again, I just try to create those safe spaces and then support knowledge transfer wherever possible. So, craft, collaboration, culture, and coaching. And then this is just something that I try to do. It's not necessarily required in every fractional engagement at all. But I have found that it has become this repeatable framework that's been really fun to kind of figure out within these companies, and just thought I would share that with you because I see this as a movement. I get a lot of questions about this model in terms of its potential to reshape the industry or at least proving that there are many paths to success beyond these more conventional corporate structures. And a lot of mentorship conversations that I've started to have really do end up revolving around this path. I think people are just hungry to see alternative routes to success, and specifically more seasoned practitioners or people who had been laid off and are, I hate to say this, but potentially aging out of the industry or feeling like they are experiencing bias because they're a little bit older. It's been interesting to have these conversations with, very impressive talent who are just having a hard time at re-entering the market for whatever reason. So yeah, it's a really interesting model. I'm still learning a lot. It's definitely still in its infancy, and I can imagine that maybe it feels a little bit more adopted here near Silicon Valley, where there tends to be a lot of innovation quickly. But with my move to Paris in January, I feel like this term may not be something that people have been hearing about. So we'll see.
But I think it's it's an interesting one because if you switch into a different industry, right? So most executives will have some kind of a coach. Some even have multiple coaches. Some have like a fitness, nutrition, longevity coach. Then some have a mindset coach, and some have like a corporate coach. There is, kind of boards and like non-executive members exists, and that's a fairly normal, that's normal for that to sort of exist. And I think this is interesting because one, I think coming in as the fractional person, you are forced by the constraint of time to focus. Like, you can't do everything. You can't be pulled in a million directions. You have to say, okay, I can only do 2, 3, 4 things at a time, and that's what you're going to focus. So it forces some sort of discipline in there, but at the same time, it's like you can come in for a period of time, you can elevate the processes, the people, the thinking, the emotions, the structure, the humans, and then you can sort of leave, which is interesting from a perspective of putting pressure, not pressure, but putting responsibility on the creative teams. It's like, we're going to get this in here, and now the obligation or expectation is an elevation in whatever the challenge is, whatever the shift is. So it's almost, there's a twofold that I'm seeing here. One is, I think owners of businesses and brands and things can see it as an investment, but there's also the return aspect of it. As if you make this leap, what you get in return is a more cohesive, more engaged, more free, more elevated, more trained sort of team, able to sort of deploy their expertise back into the business in a way that will create value for you, which is I think what everyone's looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just anecdotally, someone asked me recently, how do I feel if the company doesn't decide to move forward with my recommendation? Like, in terms of let's say I provide whatever services or suggestions, and I'm there for a few months, and then I share some kind of playbook. Maybe I even help hire my full-time replacement, and then I leave. And then I watch the company actually do the opposite, or don't implement any of it, or whatever. And it was this interesting moment where maybe when I first started, it felt more personal, or I would be disappointed or something like that, because I really believed in what it is that I was suggesting, obviously, and then if I didn't see it through, or something that it would make me feel a certain way. And now, interestingly, I feel like I'm able to feel like I did the best that I could. Things changed so quickly. I guess that what I'm saying is it doesn't end up impacting me as much. And I, stand by what it is that I suggested. But sometimes maybe it's not the right time, or things pivot, or they tried and it didn't work. And that's okay too. But yeah, it was kind of an interesting question to be asked, because it made me reflect a little bit on how I feel when I walk away, which sometimes when you're so invested in a company, let's say you're there for many, many years, and it's something you dream about, and it's kind of like in your soul, sometimes it's hard to detach. But I guess, there are there are many benefits to being able to hop around and not feel like it's not to say that I'm not personally invested in the company's success, but that you don't take it as personally, and you're able to just move on to the next thing.
I think it's also, you're touching on sort of one of my bugbears is, I don't like it when a new rebrand happens and suddenly everyone starts telling, shouting their noise into the internet about how they could have done so much better and how they wouldn't have done this. And it's obviously wrong. And these are the myriad of reasons why, where, organizations are filled with human beings. And they have a natural structure to them and a natural order to them. And often great strategy dies in execution. Sometimes a strategy is a really good strategy on paper, but when you actually start trying to pull it into the real world, it doesn't survive the reality of what's happening. I think there's so many of these things that can play out in a company, but I'm sure you'll find elements of the work survive, and it's, strategy is that thing. It's, one of my favorite quotes is Mike Tyson's, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't have a plan, and I think that's where the strategy is. You set up these beautiful things and this is working and you build the team, but then reality hits in 6 months, a year, whatever later. and things have evolved. And a good strategy should be a starting point, not necessarily an end point.
Yeah, I love that. So much of, and I love this conversation. Like, I find the most rewarding part of these relationships to be, in the process of doing it. Not necessarily did they, that kind of like final outcome, or let's say, the kind of end of the engagement. It truly is the conversations that happen along the way, watching people grow through those conversations or even become more curious or more self aware. It's almost like these micro moments that end up being the most valuable. And then, honestly, like, I mean, the best is that, like, oftentimes these relationships with the people that I meet along the way end up either helping me get future roles or end up becoming future colleagues somewhere else. Like, I'm about to do a short engagement with a company, and I'm working with the same people who used to work at a different company, and now they want to hire me at this new company. So to me, that it speaks volumes if people want to hire me again or refer
So
me.
they might not have implemented your strategy flawlessly, but they're getting you back for more. So which I think is an interesting.
So something
thing.
Worked.
Yes.
Yes.
So what is it like? Looking at some of the companies that you've sort of talked about working with. You've worked with really big brands, like large organizations, and you've worked with fairly small organizations. How does the work shift depending on the sort of scale of the kind of machine that you are jumping into?
It's a good question. So I would say most of the companies that are, engaging me in a fractional capacity, they're, realizing that they don't always need to hire a permanent executive to solve a problem or build a function. I think these roles have really come out of certain conversations and existing relationships or referrals at this point. There's still not jobs that I'm finding on a job directory. So they almost feel like, these fractional roles end up emerging from seeds that are planted as I'm catching up with someone or hearing about what's happening at a company. And then it's like something that just comes out of it. So the fractional model, that I end up pitching, I tend to talk about helping accelerate change, rather than making more costly full-time hiring mistakes. They can maybe bring in fractional leaders to help diagnose, like I said, like what specific expertise that may need. They test out different leadership approaches. I've even helped build out more thoughtful like hiring practices. And oftentimes they bring more objective perspectives to these longstanding internal problems. Again, the sweet spot for me for the fractional roles have been companies that are a little bit more mature, not necessarily startups or early stage where they, don't understand design or haven't even attempted to try to build a creative team or studio. Usually I'm inheriting a team that is either broken and needs that next stage, like whether they're lacking a creative director or leader and need to be pushed to the next level, or maybe it is the birth of kind of a new in-house creative team, but the company itself has tried a bunch of different things before and maybe haven't succeeded, and so they bring me in. I have worked with companies that you have heard of, other companies that were new to me. Like last summer, I worked with a company called Honeybook. They've been around for, I think, 11 or 12 years, but they definitely operate like a startup. And their team had been working there for a while, but that was like their first job. So most of these people on the creative team grew up within the company and then like lacked creative leadership or creative mentorship. And so the creative director had just left and I came in during this time, and then essentially was there for like 4 or 5 months with the goal to help them hire a full-time executive creative director. And I was just working directly with the CMO and diagnosed various areas of impact across those 4 C's that I talked about earlier. I still work, though. I still take on roles that are not in a fractional capacity. I'm a graphic designer by trade. I still love to design. So I guess design more tangible output. So most of the fractional roles, you could think of it as I'm helping design teams and design cultures and design studios. I get, it's still as rewarding to me to design how people work just as much as the work itself. But, there are often times where I'll, if I can, like find smaller projects where I am acting more as just a designer. It's just me working closely with the client, most likely, and they're often very small startups or nonprofits, mostly women-led or queer-led initiatives. So those smaller projects end up like really needing to align with my personal values and mission, and then usually they're in either the brand identity space or maybe very light lift like web design type work, or there have even been moments where I've experimented with engagement models where I've partnered with other independent practitioners where we co-pitch or react to a request for proposal, and then we've won the piece of business. But we're not necessarily a company, we're just two individuals who end up tag teaming to try and get work, and then end up taking on a project. And so I guess what I'm just proving out is that it's very flexible, and whether I end up taking on a fractional role that, let's say, is 4 months part-time, it gives me time to then take on maybe very small projects, whether that's a logo or something else. And then, if it's not that, maybe I have, maybe it's another project where I'm partnering with a former colleague who's also independent, and then we're tag teaming on a project. And so I guess it just exposes that a lot of what, like those older models where most companies would, historically hire, whether that was a more traditional mid-sized design studio or an ad agency to build or design up, some kind of cool output. Now what you're noticing is companies are experimenting and trying to hire, different, whether that's individuals who run their own businesses or collectives of individuals, but, whether that's a cost thing, just looking to change it up, or, the amount of overhead now, I mean, it's very, costly to hire a lot of these bigger studios and companies. So you're just kind of watching different companies experiment, which I think also the pandemic accelerated that change, and people like me are benefiting because of those models are starting to fracture.
Yes, I think it also taps into this idea, so for people listening, like how do you use this? How do you think about this? I think there's an element here of you've got other levers that you can pull. You can structure time, you can structure project, you can structure output, you can play with all of these different things that used to just be this was the only way. We know that hiring a high quality creative team and maintaining it is a large uplift. It's not an easy thing to build a studio of 10, 11, 12, 13 talented people who work really well together. It's taken me 18 years to figure out some of the stuff that we figured out to sort of keep our team. And I still don't have, I still feel like I could do more. I still feel like there's more opportunity. So this is a huge challenge. And now if that's not your primary business, how do you tap into this stuff? And I think what I'm enjoying hearing is that there's different ways of accessing these things. So, if typography is exceedingly important to you, do you need a full-time typographer, or can you find a typographer and have a fractional role with them? I'm sure they'd love having a bit of stability, and a bit of kind of consistency around that, so you can actually tap into these different pools of resource, and starting at the top, where you're working at the kind of C-suite level, but all the way down to actual talent. Like, do you need a full-time web developer, or can you work with them to design their time, and build a week that works for them, that gets you the sort of development that you need out of that? So I think that's the thing that I think is sort of universal for people listening.
Yeah. And if we talk about just the shift in what success looks like, I think, historically and still today, I mean, success often means bigger is better, or, you're only successful if you scale. And I guess what I'm witnessing and seeing a lot more of is that that's not necessarily true. That doesn't mean that couldn't be a vision of success, and that's awesome if that is what you want to do, and that can prove to be very successful. And very fun for certain individuals, but there are others where success isn't necessarily about scaling up, and growth doesn't always mean expansion. And there's a lot more power in being selective. And, in this case, I feel like for me, this concept of like bigger was always better. It always felt like if I were to choose that path, you sometimes had to choose between meaningful work and then financial stability, because you have a lot of overhead and you need to keep your staff busy, and there's a lot of responsibility related to kind of building that team or studio space. And in this case, I am trying to design my own career and like kind of figure out what success looks like, and that does evolve. It's definitely not like a fixed state. I have my own values, and I try to manifest certain collaborations that I would love to work on, but success ends up manifesting for me as this harmonious blend between the consulting, which within consulting there's the fractional work, but there's also design work within that, and then if I'm able to play my cards right and then charge enough money for the hours in which that I'm working, then it gives me time to do other things that fuel my creative practice, like mentorship, teaching, speaking, and a lot of advocacy work. So all of these activities end up allowing me to spread optimism and then create impact while making a living. But it's, me making a living on my own terms and trying to figure out how to support my lifestyle and then build my time accordingly. But yeah, it is, again, it's interesting to watch different companies experiment with these different models. I will say, I was noticing a trend towards more companies doing that. And then I'm seeing a bit of a plateau in just my own research right now. I think there's a lot of fear right now around the world, not just in the United States, but mainly because of the political and economic climate. So more companies are, returning to office or retracting on some of their more flexible policies, which is unfortunate. But that being said, there's still companies out there that are experimenting with these models. I think things are happening and trending in this direction, and more people are, shifting towards these more flexible work models. And I think the sweet spot is finding working relationships that have a mix of in-person and some, remote interaction. So more hybrid models of working. I think that, to me, having experimented in both remote and in-person working models, I feel like that's kind of the sweet spot, is being able to have a little bit of both if possible, not just being bound to a Zoom box.
We don't want to choose. We want it all.
Yeah. But there's beauty in saying that now, talent, has opened up, because now that the world has become a little bit more open to geographic limitations mattering a little less than they used to, it means that you can also find talent, outside of your immediate market, which to me I find to be good, because I'm a big proponent on diversity and inclusion, and the more perspectives on a problem, the better, and really kind of mixing up your talent pool in order to do good work. And yeah, I could go on about this forever, but yeah, this concept of designing your time, I know you and I quickly talked about in our pre-call, and I'm really interested in that, and I talk a lot about it with people. And you don't have to be a solopreneur in order to design your time. I think that's something that I also want to make sure listeners understand is, you can become a little bit more conscious of where your time goes, whether you work for yourself or work for someone else. But like that, it's that intentionality that I'm talking about, and that this age of personal agency and kind of taking control of your career and your time. That's something that I feel like is happening more and more, which is pretty cool.
Is it not also, going back a little bit to what you were talking about earlier, about how doing these different things fuels your creative practice? I think there's an element here of, if you embrace your people sort of shifting their time a little bit and kind of not just fitting into one thing, you actually get more back, because if they can tap into those other parts, they often bring that stuff back into the workplace, those different ideas, those inspirations wouldn't necessarily have come if they were sitting, at that same desk every single day. So I think
Yeah.
there's an element of that is an untapped resource that you can kind of play with to sort of get more happiness, more cohesion, more collaboration, more talent out of human beings without then necessarily having to grow the team or hire more people. You can actually just get a little bit more out of the humans that you already have.
Yeah, there. I will say. I mean, I hope that more companies decide to or start to realize that, because I still feel like few companies allow their employees, even full-time employees, to be kind of like full humans, right? Like it's like if you work for their company, you like own them, and like they can only work on what it is that that company roadmap is. Whereas if you allow them to, if you give them a little bit more flexibility, or give them, like, there are some companies that suggest that they have, like a 20% of their time should go to learning and development practices. So whether that's upskilling, in AI emerging tools, or going to a conference, or, doing something that's not like them at their desk, like, in meetings, and actually encouraging that, like almost making that part of their performance, is like a certain percentage of their time should be doing other things that then somehow contribute back, and they understand that that cycle is really healthy. If I think of a design studio where, it's not exactly one to one, but the partner model at Pentagram is such that, they have all these partners, they basically run these independent businesses, but they celebrate those individuals for all of what they do inside and outside of Pentagram. And that studio is long lasting. It continues to be a successful model. Not, most companies end up, really, I don't know, I guess controlling all of your time. And I hope that more companies start to realize that if you release I don't know, I'm going to say leash, but not, that's not really what I mean, but like be, a little bit less like releasing the control a little bit, and allowing more of the human, like all the dimensions of that person's humanity, to maybe kind of encourage them, or give them the freedom, or give them more sabbaticals or mental health moments or time for learning, that they end up benefiting long term. It comes back, but they don't always think like that, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully this conversation can be something that shifts that. And
Yeah,
Rachel,
it is a culture shift for sure.
Definitely. I want to ask you one last question.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed your contractor wrapped on your Instagram channel. Tell me a little bit about, what I enjoy sort of making this a little bit sort of reflective is how you've kind of built a little bit of a brand around yourself in terms of like how you talk about the different aspects of what you do and how that's part of a whole and how that whole is interesting. And that's, this sort of this whole thing summed up. Can you talk about why, like what is contractor wrapped and why do you do it? And has it sort of, what are the unintended consequences of it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for reading that and coming across it. So for those of you listening who have no idea what Ross is referring to, the Contractor Wrapped is a LinkedIn series that I started a few years ago that essentially is a place where I share my revenue breakdown. And it became a series because I saw how people were reacting and how it made them feel, which it's all centered around salary transparency or rate transparency and compensation. What it helped others do was it helped them benchmark their worth, or forces them to ask questions about, am I charging enough or too little, or not, or more, am I charging appropriately? And as a queer designer, but also just as someone who cares a lot about marginalized voices, I feel like they often, or even as women, statistically still, we often face pay disparity and end up being challenged more aggressively during salary negotiations. So I believe, and I've seen this in practice, that by being more transparent about compensation and money, which is still a pretty taboo topic to talk about, in the US for sure, in a lot of different cultures. I mean, generally around the world, people don't, organically just like share how much money they make or what they charge. But I feel like by doing that, we end up creating accountability and then help each other get paid equitably. So I guess I do it with the hope that more people will do it. And then if more people do it, then we can help each other get paid more, because essentially what happens is if you end up undervaluing your worth, whether that's as a fractional leader or a designer or any title in the industry, you're setting a precedent for what clients understand that skill set is valued at. And so the more we start charging more fairly, then we can help each other get paid better. So I don't know, I guess I have found that then it then comes back to me, because there's less education that I have to do in order to sell through why I think I should get charged a certain amount. Although I will say in the last few years in these fractional roles, I don't get as much pushback. I have gotten comments like, "Oh, you're expensive," or "Okay, that's different than what we would normally charge," and then we kind of talk through it. But throughout my entire career, this has been a thing. So I guess this is to encourage other independent individuals to share how much money they're worth. But even if you're not a solopreneur, if you feel comfortable sharing your own stats and learnings, I definitely encourage it. So that's what that's about. I didn't do it in my first year, but honestly, basically as soon as I started tracking my time more religiously, which I know we talked about designing time, but in order to design your time, you have to track your time. If you want the data.
Make the whole team listen to this.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because it's one thing to track your time for billable work, but what if you also tracked your time for non-billable work? And then it really gives you a sense of where your time goes, whether that's, working on a proposal or mentoring someone or, working on an actual like design output. So it's really that tracking process that's giving me a few years of data. And then that informs these end of year business recaps that we were just talking about. But then it also allows me to reflect on my own business structure and then think about that intention. Like, am I spending time on the right things? Does it align with my values? Am I balanced across these different types of work? Is it still fulfilling for me? And then that chart ends up looking different every year. Sometimes a new activity gets introduced. Like early on a few years ago, I wasn't doing as much writing. Now I'm doing a little bit more writing. Not that I'm a writer by trade, but I'm, just writing more as a new creative outlet for sharing ideas or perspectives about things that I'm noticing in the industry. And so that has, been a new section of where my time has gone. And in the past, that wasn't the case. So contract are wrapped. I'm excited to work on the one later this year. This year was definitely different. I experimented with a few models of working that were just new. I did like a maternity coverage for Airbnb for several months. And then I worked on another short-term project, but it had like a lot more hours involved. And so I definitely think that there'll be a lot of learnings in terms of where my time went this year. And so if you're interested, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn or check out my past series and then follow along. But Ross, I appreciate you bringing that up, since it's definitely, anything about money or pay transparency or just making sure that people get paid what they're worth is obviously a big passion of mine. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for your energy. Thank you for your work. Hopefully people have learned something. I've definitely got some ideas about how to structure the team and do something slightly different. So thank you very much for showing up, and thank you for listening. We'll catch all of you in the next one. Bye-bye.